Arise, arise, your light has come. Nations will come, all will come, all will come. Arise, arise, your light has come. Nations will come, all will come, all will come. For your love has turned us around. Your love has turned us around. These walls we built are all coming on down. Nations will come, all will come, all will come. Arise, arise, your light has come. Nations will come, all will come, all will come. Arise, arise, your light has come. Nations will come, all will come, all will come. For your love has turned us around. Your love has turned us around. These walls we built are all coming on down. Nations will come, all will come, all will come. Nations will come, all will come, all will come. For your love has turned us around. Your love has turned us around. These walls we've built are all coming on down. Nations will come, all will come, all will come. Nations will come, all will come, all will come. Nations will come, all will come, all will come.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back together. So we had an excellent selection of workshops this morning and last night. We would love to hear which ones you attended, so let us know in the chat box. And we hope you also were able to screen one of the documentaries last night. Let us know which documentary you got to see and what you thought of it also in the chat. So we are about to get ready for our Ask Plenary, but I'd like to bring everyone's attention to the EAD offering opportunities this year before we do get to the Ask Plenary. So EAD annually has a offering option. This year, obviously it's virtual because everything is. And the two offering options are agricultural efforts to mitigate the effects of climate change for families and communities in Haiti. And this is supported by Church World Service. A little bit more about that is this program teaches climate adaptive farming techniques, creates broader seed access, revitalizes local cisterns, and plants tree nurseries. An increase in hurricanes has hit northwestern Haiti hard, and these initiatives support climate resilience and adaptation at one of the many front lines of the climate crisis. And then the second offering option is Community Climate Resilience Centers in Bangladesh, and this is supported by Global Ministries of the Christian Church, otherwise known as Disciples of Christ, and the United Church of Christ. The Community Resilience Centers are staffed by locals. The centers focus on climate change mitigation and disaster management as flooding, cyclones, and erosion become increasingly common and dangerous due to the climate crisis. The Community Climate Resilience Centers provide capacity building courses and implement actions with local governments. This includes climate change risk assessments, climate resilient agriculture and livelihood opportunities, and installing local freshwater access technology. So if those sounded interesting to you and you want to find out more or give a contribution, please visit advocacydays.org/offering. And maybe someone can put that in the chat. And you will be able to find more there and give a contribution. So those are all the announcements for this morning, and time to pass it to Jose. Thanks, everyone.
Great, thank you, Annika. When Annika, Christian, and I, co-MCs, were trying to figure out who would introduce who at this conference, I jumped at the chance to introduce Jackie Patterson, my dear friend. You know, you have rare people in your lives where you look upon them and you say, how does she do that? Where does she find the time? How does she know so much? And how is she so effective? Does she work 24 hours a day? Just an absolute inspiration. And Jackie Patterson is one of those people in my life. And so Jackie is the director of the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program. She also served as coordinator and co-founder of Women of Color United. So I am absolutely delighted and honored to introduce Jackie Patterson. So Jackie.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be introduced by you and to be reconnected, and hopefully this will be the beginning of us talking a little bit more as we used to in the old days.
And there we go.
Oh, okay. Okay, good. Yeah, thanks. So I'll say again, it's a delight to be with you all, and it's an honor to be introduced by Jose, who is a dear friend, timelessly. Hopefully, we'll be able to connect more going forward. And so it's a joy to be with you all to have this conversation. I have been asked to speak on the topic of kind of really how do we advance a policy path for restoration of earth and people. And I was asked specifically to offer a historical or policy background on the intersecting issues of global climate justice. And so I gave it a lot of thought and reflected on when I started to come into understanding of the relationship between US domestic and foreign policy, and how this sits within the broader geopolitical system of the planet. And in so doing, I wanted to share I was born and raised on the south side of Chicago, and my mom came up to Chicago through the Great Migration from a tiny unincorporated area of Mississippi called Dublin. And my dad came to Chicago, sorry, as an immigrant from Jamaica, where he was, like so many, came seeking opportunity in the very nation that was instrumental in stripping his homeland of the opportunity to be self-sufficient, like so many industrialized nations do at the global south. So as my remarks are to center on the intersection of domestic and foreign policy in the context of earth rights and climate change, I thought it fitting to start with a 13-minute excerpt from the film Life and Debt, the documentary film. So it's set in Jamaica and tells a story that's illustrative of the path of imperialism in US domestic and foreign policies and practices, which has led us to where we are on a collision course with catastrophic climate change. But in the voices and the people of Jamaica, we get a snapshot of the impacts of US pursuit in amassing wealth and power, creating dependencies, and systematizing imperialism through trade policies and along with other industrialized nations through structural adjustment programs. So we'll ask Matt to cue the video clip, and then I'll come back and hear more.
Rich man's wealth is in the city. Oh, destruction of the poor is our poverty. Lord, destruction of our soul is vanity. Well, do you hear? Naughty dread wonder if you will. Whoa, I and I, we want to rule our destiny. Oh yeah, I and I, Jah will make you rule our destiny.
So the system set it, you know. For if them don't have you fighting against yourself, them gonna have trouble. For if them see you unite within yourself, them know so for them all get slacker. But when them can't get you struggling among yourself, them all is tighter. And that is all them set it.
Right now you have tons of cabbage of waste in Jamaica because goods coming in from America selling cheaper
than what produced
than
here.
what can be produced here.
Of course it is.
So you find it's just extracting more than putting in.
The Jamaica that I knew, the Jamaica in which I grew up, is not the Jamaica that you, a tourist, would see now. That Jamaica no longer exists. That Jamaica no longer exists, partly for the usual reason, the passing of time, and partly because of this new global economy.
Well, when you say the onion produced in this year, you can look at every house or every yard that you see around here. Everybody, all young, middle-aged, involved in picking out onion, sowing onion, reaping onion, bagging up onion. So everybody was involved in the production in this district. But right now, it is just a trickle, just the brave one them.
When it's ready for harvesting, you see imported potato right out in front of your home being sold. Potato that's grown in Idaho or New Brunswick or some other parts.
My name is Tom Lipitsky. I'm with the United States Potato Board, and we represent about 6,000 potato producers in the United States. One of the markets which we found to be of very much interest is right here in Jamaica.
Get you up here, Mr. Harrison.
There we go. Well, okay. Everybody say potato.
Jamaican potato.
We had offers from Washington from some guys, a group of guys. We asked them what they wanted to buy from us, and there wasn't anything that they could buy from us. They just wanted to sell us potato seeds. We are not short of potato seeds. That's not our problem.
I'll give you a joke. You talk about get goods in the United States. I signed a contract to produce honeydew melon and cherry tomato. And you know what happened? Everything I send to the package, they turn it down, say it not reach the standard. They say don't package good. The size that we have is not meshing with their size. And the system went on so rotten with me that you know what I did? Discard it total.
When I was a little boy, I grew. Everybody that you see around here, their livelihood was planting peanuts. All those days are over. Over and gone.
All this land is what we used to farm carrots. Now we cannot farm anymore. We don't got any market for it. Cause through the foreign carrots.
You taste a delicious Jamaican-grown banana for the very first time. You wonder how it is that you've never tasted such a sweet banana before.
Daylight come and me want go home. Work all night and a drink a rum. Daylight come and me want go home. Stack banana till the morning come. Daylight come and me want go home. Come, Mr. Tallyman, tally me banana. Daylight come and me want go home. Come, Mr. Tallyman, tally me banana. Daylight come and me want go home. A beautiful bunch, a ripe banana. Daylight come and me want go home. Hide the deadly black tarantula. Daylight come and me want go home. Live 6 foot, 7 foot, 8 foot bunch. Daylight come and me want go home. 6 foot, 7 foot, 8 foot bunch. Daylight come and me want go home. Day is a day. Oh.
I actually was born in a banana farm for over years, and I've been doing banana for all these years until
lately the WTO ruling has affected the industry. I've been handling banana from in the early 60s. And recently I'm not really exporting now because of the situation, the way they treat us.
We produce or export, and we would love to continue export to the fullest.
Jamaica produces at the moment in the region of 90,000 tons of bananas, all of which go into the UK, and that is our market.
McDonald's started talking to us about 3 years ago. This facility, which cost us $40 million to upgrade, was put in place to facilitate people like McDonald's and Burger King, increase our production and make patties that they wouldn't have to be importing them. McDonald's have asked us to supply them with a HACCP plan. We have done that. We have made burgers for them, which they have sampled and found to be okay. In fact, the taste has been much better than the ones they had imported, but we still have not been able to supply them.
Beef farmers from several parishes who've been hurting from the importation of less expensive meat today vented their frustrations against fast food giant McDonald's.
Yeah, well, I've been in farming from 1977. And I've never had a problem in all those years selling cow until last year. Although these animals should have been sold from December. We just canceled them. In America, you wouldn't find cows grazing in the pasture like this. They are injected with an anabolic steroid known as stilbestrol. We can't use stilbestrol here, it just doesn't come into the country. But it's been used on farms abroad. So when the people are consuming imported beef, they are really exposing themselves to cancer-causing agents.
We had a case where one of the local businessmen thought it'd be a good deal if he could buy some chicken cheap. When they came up with an idea that they would import some chicken. This chicken, it turns out upon examination, was I think about 20 years old. When we determined that, yes, it was not for human consumption, he tried to convince us that the shipment only came here accidentally, and that the shipment was in fact for Haiti, and that we should release it back into his custody so he could send it on to Haiti.
I been in America. I never seen nowhere in the store where them sell chicken back. But yet I see it leave America and come to Jamaica.
Well, it's from slavery, you know. Remember, slavery was that the master would eat what he considered the better part. And then the slaves would get the refused. So the back and the neck and the tail and the foot and all these things is like a third world country dumping ground.
A very interesting thing in the US poultry market has been the development of the passion for white meat. Obviously, if you take the breast meat off a chicken, you're left with the dark meat, the leg and the thigh, and the neck and the back. As a consequence, there is more and more of the dark meat, which is imported from the United States of America. And that has really been the threat to our market at this point. When the cost of producing a pound of breast chicken meat in the States is very likely about 50 cents, it was being offered to Jamaica as low as 20 cents a pound. This had a traumatic effect in terms of our local industry and our ability to compete. There's no doubt that the markets in our region have been targeted by the US industry in terms of penetrating and supplying those markets at the detriment to the local industry and the possible loss of jobs. We're told that we've got to find areas we can compete. And we say, what? What are these niche markets that we're meant to be going after? They tell us, well, peppers and spices and these things, you should be able to grow those efficiently, and you do have tourism.
2, 3, and he's off, and he's going, oh my goodness, smooth. And he's up to his second beer in a minute now, and it's all gone. Come on, everybody, let's hear it for Drew. Chug, chug, chug. Oh boy. Oh! gonna be, oh my goodness, try to remain on your feet now.
You decide to venture from the sanctity of your tropical compound. You see natives. You marvel at the things they can do with their hair, the things they fashion out of cheap twine or ordinary cloth.
You having a good time?
Squatting on the side of the road, hanging out with all the time in the world. You might look at them and think, they're so relaxed, so laid back. They're never in a hurry.
You get a right for your money, get your money. And them brainwash up on your western journey. Babylon give them a ride. For the money, get them funny. And them brainwash up on their western journey.
Every native of every place is a potential tourist. And every tourist is a native of somewhere. Every native would like to find a way out. Every native would like a rest. Every native would like a tour. But some natives, most natives in the world, cannot go anywhere. They're too poor to escape the realities of their lives. And they're too poor to live properly in the place where they live, which is the very place that you, the tourist, want to go. So when the natives see you, the tourist, they envy you. They envy your own ability to leave your own banality and boredom. They envy your ability to turn their own banality and boredom into a source of pleasure for yourself.
Try reach whenever you drop off and strain. Appointed and anointed, get to use them ordained. Mr. Fill up the youth, them only fi stop work fi fine. Words without words can't sustain. And Mr. Fi tell you this, so when you on a game, stop call them parables. Last name in a vine. Check it out, and now them live down the line. Babylon give them a right, pay them money, get them money, and then brainwash them on them western journey.
Thank you so much. Hopefully you can hear me again. I know there's a delay with the audio, but Jose, if you can nod, if you can hear me, then I'll know everybody else can. Okay, good. So thank you all for indulging. We go by these principles of democratic organizing called the Jimenez principles, and one of the key Jimenez principles is letting the people speak for themselves. And a lot when I'm kind of on the speaking in different places, I always like to use video so that people can really tell their own story in their own voice, and as opposed to it kind of going through the filter of my interpretation and my sharing. And so thank you all for watching and for experiencing. And so as I said before, this film really represents the ways that this notion of enclosure of. Thank you so much, Sandy. I'm appreciating that. So the enclosure of wealth and power has been done by industrialized nations, and particularly in the United States, through creating dependencies. I mean, they really just told that story in such a clear way in these sectors, in particular agricultural sector here, but we see that happen in sector after sector. And then we've seen how the the systematization of domination and dependency through trade policies. That the one fellow who is specifically referenced the WTO, through financial policies, through governance policies, and we see the results in terms of harming the local economy, in terms of harming the environment through unnecessary shipping and trucking of goods, in terms of disturbing the ecosystem through genetically modified organisms, and from everything from the seeds to the steroids that they're pumping into to animals, and upsetting the very nature and relationship of our earth systems. As the one gentleman said in the film, we don't need seeds, we already have seeds. And so this is all the ways that we're seeing that through that very just 13 minutes of just a illustrative story. So as we dive deeper into the history, our present course, and the path that we need to set ourselves on to restore Earth and her people as per my mandate, I want to start with a reminder that our ecosystem was divinely designed. We know that the Earth systems are structured to be regenerative and to provide all that we need with abundance. And whether it is the ant and bee colonies, the zebra dazzles, which I learned that the zebra groups are called dazzles. That was an education. Or the lion prides. Most creatures on Earth know that cooperation is the key to survival and well being for all. It's only humanity, and particularly the dominant culture of industrialized nations, that have managed to largely muck up the plan, really, of how the Earth systems work. And so the historical review that I'll share of how we went astray from that kind of divine design will start at the juncture that I best know, with the colonization of these indigenous lands and the making of what has now become the United States of America. And I'll intersperse a bit of what I've grown to understand of geopolitics and macroeconomics through my work in Asia, the Caribbean, and sub-Saharan Africa, and really kind of wind us up with the solutions that will lead into what will be the next session, really on the specific policy asks that are being put forward today. So first off, we know we've kind of the nation started with folks coming over, and it's funny, kind of the not funny, haha, but the romanticized ways that people are characterized as explorers. We talk about the forefathers and all of these kind of very positive types of terms, and and then when you look at why folks came over, and then what people did in order to attain what they thought that they needed, is where we start to have problems from the very beginning. This notion of, again, this enclosure of wealth and power. The values and principles and practices include materialism, greed, extraction, exploitation, domination. And so the way the mineral resources that people came in pursuit of, and then that the ways that people took over land drove people off of their land, and with murder and other means of force, is really the founding principles and practices of this nation. Um, and so when we see how from there all of this went into our policy making. So whether it's the policies that allowed for kind of taking over of land, the fact that people went over and then put people in the hulls of ships as commodities that were then traded on a market that started at that point, and that has gone on till today. Um, and became commoditized people that who were then put monetary value on, and then again the start of the reckless extraction and exploitation of natural resources at the same time. So we had that happening, and then going on from there into the types of policies that then institutionalized the privileging of a few, and the disadvantage of too many. And so with the notion that there's not enough for everyone, so in order for me to be well, I have to oppress you, as opposed to recognizing that it's not an inverse relationship. Again, this is the place of abundance. These are our lands are abundant, and again, they're divinely designed. But instead, we had the kind of institutionalization of this oppression, starting with like the Morrill and Homestead Acts, which provided resources to white folks just before emancipation to gather land and so forth. Whereas African Americans, then after being emancipated, then they didn't have the ability to have resources to get land in the same way. And when people even were able to amass enough resources to get land, they didn't have the legal resources to be able to hand down that land from generation to generation as readily as other people did. Then we had, furthermore, uh, uh, subsequent policies like redlining and so forth that kept people in segregated areas, that then became the areas where there wasn't access to food, there wasn't access to transportation in the same way, there wasn't access to but what we did have access to was the polluting facilities, like the energy production facilities, where we have African American families on making $50,000 a year are more likely to live next to a polluting facility than a white American family making $15,000 a year. So again, even over income, race is a factor of exposure. Where we have African American children who are exposed to sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, mercury, arsenic, lead, and so forth, and are 3 to 5 times more likely to enter the hospital from an asthma attack and 2 to 3 times more likely to die of an asthma attack. We have indigenous communities in the Four Corner region and Navajo lands for miles and miles where there were the 3 coal-fired power plants within a 30-mile radius of the indigenous lands, but yet 70% of the people in these Navajo Nation there don't have electricity or running water, while those plants go to supply electricity for Phoenix and for Las Vegas. And so these are the types of inequities that we have. And then we have an energy system that's propped up by subsidies and bailouts, and propping up investor-owned utilities, which seek to again concentrate wealth and power in the hands of a few. And then we have now exporting, even as we try to wean ourselves from coal or from, we have the export of coal, so that then those problems are visited upon other nations, and the export of liquefied natural gas. We have the kind of further solidification of this corporatocracy through Citizens United and these types of policies that give corporate this notion of corporate personhood that really kind of keeps the corporations in power, and all of this within a capitalist economy. If someone just asked me the other day about about my kind of questioning about the economy and the marriage of money and politics, and was saying, it sounds a little bit like socialism. And I said, well, as a people who have been the actual capital within a capitalist system, it's not necessarily something that's ever been friendly to us. And so this is these are the challenges that we talk about in terms of an economy that's predicated on there being winners and losers, and always the oppressed, the folks who are oppressed and marginalized are down racial lines and other line and economic lines as well. So then we talk about foreign policy. We know, as we said before, trade policies prohibiting manufacturing and other restrictions that again can concentrate wealth and power. We have aid that's tied to the patronage of U.S. companies. When I was working on HIV and AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa, the millions of dollars that were coming across in funding for HIV and AIDS, the antiretroviral drugs had to be bought from the U.S. companies like Pfizer and so forth, and could not be bought from companies that were in India that were creating drugs that were literally 1,000% less in terms of the. Meanwhile, people were dying to such an extent that they had to to dig graves 12 feet under, so that they can put a grave at 12 feet and then another one at 6 feet, because they didn't have enough room in the cemeteries to bury all the people that were dying of HIV and AIDS, and yet they were concentrating again wealth and power in the hands of a few. We know with the agriculture system, with the policies that we have, where we're providing subsidies and enabling groups like Monsanto that are making single cycle seeds. Vandana Shiva talks about the suicide rates in India as a result of their agriculture shifts. We also know about the structural adjustment policies that impact basic services and impact the access to the commons. We know that there's more Malawian nurses in the United Kingdom than there are in the whole of Malawi, just as an example, and education fees and other impacts. We also know that militarism, propped up by major investments in the military system, while we have communities that are in abject poverty in the United States. One of the communities I work with, Sand Branch, Texas, has never had running water since it's a freedmen settlement, since it was established in 1865. We know in the context of COVID-19 that even as this drugs were being developed, that the vaccine trials were happening in sub-Saharan Africa, and as some countries had procured more than 5 times the amount of their populations, the very same countries that were used in vaccine trials didn't have access to the vaccines that came online. We also know that again, going back to the energy sector, that we have places like in Mpumalanga in South Africa, which because of the coal mines, it makes it the most polluted place on earth. And again, these are the types of circumstances while our imperialist practices aren't allowing countries to be able to develop the clean energy, the energy efficiency, the regenerative policies and practices. And then at the same time, wrapping up on the negative, so I can spend the last 3 minutes talking about the positive. We also know that the U.S. is 4% of the global population, yet 25% of the emissions that drive climate change, and that's just what's happening in the United States. It doesn't count the fact that we're exporting more creating sources like the coal exports and the LNG exports. And so while we're 4% of the global population and at least 25% of the emissions that drive climate change, we also then have these punitive policies when their lands are no longer inhabitable because of shifts in agricultural yields or because of disasters, and they come just seeking refuge, and we turn them away or we put them in cages instead. Yet in the past, we have both played an obstructionist role in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change with stingy commitments at best, and that was bad enough before we pulled out of the Paris Agreement altogether. So as we've turned the page in my last minute and 75 seconds, how do we get back on track with a policy path for restoration for Earth and people? First, we have to really ground ourselves in terms of our policy framework and operating principles, practices, and values rooted in the vision of just transition as developed by the folks on the front line of environmental and climate justice, facilitated by Movement Generation. But we have to ground our policy platform in caring for the sacred, in cooperation, in regeneration, in democracy, and in recognizing abundance and interdependence. We have to shift away from a corporatocracy into a true deep democracy. And so when we talk about our global systems, we have to ensure that we're focusing on localism. So in Jamaica, if they were able to create their own food for themselves, then they would be able to have what they need, and we wouldn't have the shipping and trucking that is contributing to the harms in our planet. And I have like a whole list of 13 different areas, but I will say, since I only have about 10 seconds left, that we need to be thinking in every sector of our global and domestic policies where we're focusing on localism, we're focusing on regeneration, we're focusing on making sure that we actually have policies that do care for the sacred, that do are rooted in democracy and abundance and cooperation. So with those core values at the center of our policy making, justice will flow. I know I've presented a lot in the way of the components of the systems change we need, and also at a lightning speed, but this is the basis for the rather expansive policy platform that we're advancing at the NAACP in partnership with groups here in this room like Center for Earth Ethics, the Out of Union Theological Seminary, United Methodist Women, Interfaith Moral Action on Climate, Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, Presbyterian Church USA, and more. But fortunately for you, the organizers have come up with a more specific set of policy demands or asks to focus on. I saw that someone put it in the chat and someone will be talking more about it. So you have more bite-sized foci within this larger systems change we need, working in concert together around all of these systems changes that we need. And really at the core, we can really transform to a global society that's truly centered in liberty and justice for all, including a harmonious relationship with our blessing of the Mother Earth. So I'll hand it back to Jose, and thank you all.
I told you, folks. She's amazing, full of passion. Thank you, Jackie. Just so blessed to have you here. I'm actually handing it off to Annika. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Jackie, thank you so much for your message and for sharing this video as we prepare for our congressional ask. The video so clearly showed how environmental, structural, and social harm caused by extraction and colonialism has harmed so many places internationally. In this video, Jamaica was featured. And I appreciate how you linked the same type of extraction and human commodification to Black, Indigenous, and communities of color here in the United States. You have illustrated how important it is that we take our ask to ecumenical advocacy days attendees and demand that Congress take responsibilities for harm caused internationally and domestically. So thank you so much for that presentation. And I think it's put us in a great space to hear what our ask is. So with that, I am going to pass it off to our ask team. And this video was created by Elizabeth Lee, Reverend Dr. Angelique Walker-Smith, Chloe Noel, Karen Bigelow, and Clara Waybright. This group is a cohort of the Ask Committee, and we are really grateful to them for creating this Ask video. And after the video, we are going to have a Q&A session with the featured speakers from the video. So we can take it to the video. Thanks.
Before we get started, I want to introduce the folks who will be sharing the content of this presentation. I am fortunate to be the moderator of this space. My name is Clara Waybright, and I work with Mennonite Central Committee in Washington, D.C. Here with me is Karen Bigelow from Bread for the World. She's a policy advisor. We have Elizabeth Chinghe Lee, Executive for Economic and Environmental Justice and Climate Justice Lead for United Methodist Women. We have Reverend Dr. Angelique Walker-Smith, Senior Associate for Pan-African and Orthodox Faith Engagement, Bread for the World in Washington, D.C. And we have Chloe Noel, Faith Economy Ecology Project Coordinator at the Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns. I'm now going to start sharing my screen, and I'm going to give a little bit more background before I hand it over to Karen, who will go first. We are presenting legislative asks connected to this theme of climate justice. As the largest historic contributor to climate change, the United States has unique responsibilities to this issue. We come at this issue as people of faith, bringing a domestic and an international ask. An ask, as a note for those of you who are unfamiliar, is a request for something you're asking Congress to do. These asks that we have worked on with many folks who come to EAD together every year, these asks are tangible ways that we can ask Congress to direct resources towards seeking climate justice, towards addressing climate change, and our disproportionate role in creating this problem. The goal of this presentation is to prepare all of you as advocates for the work that you'll be doing as you go into these meetings with your members of Congress. I'm going to start with the domestic ask, and I will hand that over first to Karen Bigelow. Karen.
Thanks so much for turning it over to me. As you all see in the documents that have been shared via EAD, our overarching ask is that we urge Congress to enact infrastructure and energy legislation that will promote climate, economic, gender, and racial justice to accelerate the transition to a clean energy economy and commit to net zero climate pollution in electricity by 2030 and economy-wide by 2050. I'm now going to turn it over to Liz to then talk more about why this is so important.
Thank you, Karen. The first thing we want to address is why do we need to transition to a clean energy economy? And it includes net zero climate pollution and electricity by 2035 and economy-wide by 2050. First, fossil fuel emissions are the main source of air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions in the United States and worldwide. A recent study published in February of this year in Environmental Research determined that air pollution from fossil fuels kills nearly 1 in 5 people worldwide. This is exposure from fine particulate matter from burning fossil fuels, and it was responsible for 8.7 million deaths globally in 2018. In the United States, given the sin of structural racism, fossil fuel particularly impacts communities of color. And race, not poverty, is the strongest predictor of exposure to fossil fuel air pollution. In 46 states, communities of color are exposed to higher levels of air pollution than white communities, where African Americans, regardless of wealth, are exposed to 54% more air pollution than the population as a whole. The fossil fuels that you and I use to heat our homes, drive our cars, be on this event together currently supply 80% of the energy needs in the United States. And that's 62% of electricity. The good news is that transitioning to renewable resources such as wind and solar power will reduce and ultimately end our reliance on these polluting energy sources of fossil fuels. Next slide. Climate scientists and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report on 1.5 degrees Celsius have noted that it's critical to limit the planet's increase in temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, reaching this ambitious goal of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2035 and 2050 will help us ensure that this happens because our actions have oversized consequences. We're only 4% of the world's population, but we've produced 25% of cumulative greenhouse gas emissions. And exceeding the 1.5 degree limit will cause devastating consequences that are irreversible. Catastrophic damage to the climate, including surges in the frequency and severity of dangerous heat waves, droughts, and floods that lead to hundreds of millions of additional people into extreme poverty.
Thanks so much, Liz, for setting the stage on why clean energy is so essential during this time, especially from a climate justice lens. One of the overarching themes that we talked about was the need for equitable climate. And so for our first ask, we talk about the need that we equitably address climate change in the United States. And so for many of you, you all have seen in your own communities You've all seen in your communities across the United States that there's devastating impacts. We've seen hurricanes, we've seen deep freezes in areas that aren't typically, known to have deep freezes, such as Texas earlier this year. We've seen different climate crises happen, such as wildfires. And at this point, we really want you to go to your members of Congress and talk about the stories that you've seen. How has your experience been impacted when it comes to climate change? Make your experience local. Talk about what's happening in your region. You don't have to be an expert when it comes to climate issues, but you can be an expert about what you've witnessed and experienced. And so go from that point, really make this experience personal as you talk about how your community and the community around you have been impacted by the climate crisis. Next slide. And so our second ask is that we need legislation that modernizes crumbling infrastructure and increases transportation efficiency and decarbonization while prioritizing racial, economic, and gender justice. And so what we find is that Black, Indigenous, Latino, and Latina communities are often more vulnerable to climate shocks due to crumbling infrastructure. Often the crumbling infrastructure is due to disinvestment in these communities, not having equitable investment in these communities over the years in comparison to predominantly white neighborhoods. And so often when these natural disasters or these climate shocks happen, these communities are often not in a position to be able to actually cope with the changes that happen. And what we've seen is that after a natural disaster, especially a natural disaster that may cause flooding, we'll see Latino, Indigenous, or African Americans actually stranded in some of their communities where they're not able to get across bridges that may be flooded, that may cause them to be unable to get to their jobs, to make their livelihoods, or even to get access to basic necessities such as groceries. And so what we know is that any infrastructure bill that will happen in the future has to have good infrastructure that will offset disproportionate economic impacts of climate change on directly impacted communities. And not only is it important to consider the needs of these communities, but we also have to include these communities into the co-creation of any resilience planning that happens and infrastructure plans. They have to be a part of the implementation process, and they also have to be a part of the evaluation process because they know best what's happening in their communities. Next slide.
And our third ask is that we need legislation that not only embraces renewable energy, but also supports a just transition for disproportionately impacted workers and communities that does not increase economic inequities. So the great news is that the cost of renewable energy has drastically decreased over the years. Think about wind and solar that did not seem feasible 20 years ago. It's actually comparable, if not cheaper, than conventional energies such as nuclear and coal. The other thing is that when we're thinking about this transition, we must have jobs that are moving forward in addressing this crumbling infrastructure and also to ensure just transition. So what does that mean? This means that the job creation is essential and that we must have deep investment, comprehensive job training, and support must be provided for fossil fuel energy workers, the surrounding communities, and we think about the tax base and all of that transition that's included, impacting communities that include fence line communities, those communities that are located near fossil fuel industries, pipelines, highly polluted roads and highways, with the air pollution from fossil fuel diesel-driven cars, which is more often located in Black, Indigenous, communities of color, and low-wealth communities. And in this process, we must ensure that they are receiving the health and economic benefits of the clean energy transition. These jobs should not be purely jobs that are providing a paycheck, but does not provide security. So we're advocating for livable wages, that it also counteracts job segregation by race and gender, and that there are training and skills development programs so that they can move into these new career paths. So these are our domestic asks, and we will now transition over to the international asks.
I didn't know if you were going to go clear or not, but I'm happy to go on unless you would like to add some comment at this point.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. I am so grateful to my colleagues for all of what they have shared so much. It's very helpful to this discussion. We're now prepared to go to the international ask, and I get the great joy of just giving the opening, and then I'm going to go over to my colleague, Chloe. The international ask, well, we are urging Congress to provide funding for multilateral and bilateral environmental accounts for FY 2022. We are asking for the $2 billion for the Green Climate Fund and focusing on funding for the most impacted countries and communities. In many cases, these countries and communities are burdened by historic colonization and ongoing inequities. So why these accounts and why these programs? Well, these initiatives build climate resilience and preserve critical ecosystems while engaging communities most affected by climate change. There are many stories that could be told about this. You heard some of them in the domestic context, but we're also saying that in the global context, we can see some of these same kinds of stories that are being exhibited both domestically and globally. We're inviting you to name your story, whatever that may be, because we are reminded, as we said at the beginning, that as people of faith, we believe the U.S. must stand alongside of these countries that will be most burdened by climate change, and especially communities most impacted in these countries. To do otherwise would only exacerbate existing inequities that stem from historic colonization and ongoing discrimination. And therefore, it is for this reason we ask that the U.S. support this funding as an opportunity to meaningfully address the climate crisis and contribute to the global commitments of the Paris Agreement. We believe that this is a good time, a timely moment for us to engage in these initiatives. We, as the highest emitters and wealthiest countries like the United States, have a responsibility to mitigate the impacts of the climate crisis in partnership with peoples and countries most impacted by supporting their leadership and adapting to changing conditions. So this is a partnership coming alongside together to address climate change with the resources that are available. We also want to speak into this moment about China, because there are questions about that. We understand that although China leads the world in overall greenhouse gas emissions, it is the United States that has the highest per capita emissions and is the largest historic emitter, as previously stated. But both China and the US both have a responsibility for climate action. And this is the case, we would say, all over the world. But China and US have a unique role to play in addressing climate change. Now it is my joy to turn it over to my colleague, Chloe, to speak about our first international ask.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much, Angelique, for setting the stage. Our first international ask is to contribute $2 billion for the Green Climate Fund. The GCF is the largest multilateral fund dedicated to funding prevention and response to climate-driven disasters in developing countries. It's dedicated to catalyze other sources of finance, including the global finance goal under the Paris Agreement. So the idea is that they put forward some funding and other sources of funding from development banks and other countries, and other aid agencies contribute money in order to put forth these types of projects. And the GCF projects prioritize women, girls, men, and boys from socially excluded and vulnerable countries, with special focus on women and girls, as we know that they are disproportionately impacted by climate change, often excluded from decision making, and yet central to their communities and to their families. The Green Climate Fund uses their monies to go towards 50% mitigation and 50% adaptation. And of the adaptation funding, priority is given to small island states, African countries, and least developed countries who experience the greatest amount of climate disasters and inequities and are least able to adapt and mitigate those activities. And the other 50% goes towards other developing countries. In 2014, the US gave $3 billion as a pledge to the Green Climate Fund. And of that, only $1 billion was fulfilled under the Obama administration, and no money went to the Green Climate Fund in the past 4 years. So it is for this reason that we ask you, Congress, to fulfill the US commitment to the Green Climate Fund to assist the most climate vulnerable nations by appropriating the remaining $2 billion through the state and foreign operations budget process. We know that we have a responsibility to fulfill our pledge, and that we also have the responsibility to give more into the future. So this will be an important moment for Congress to make a positive, robust pledge that we can hopefully continue for the next 4 years. The second international ask, I will speak to the first part of it and then turn it over to my colleague Angelique again to speak to the bilateral funds. The second international ask is to support additional multilateral and bilateral funds that repair global relationships and engage in diplomatic partnerships while working to address our disproportionate contributions to climate change and addressing other environmental challenges. Multilateral funds are funds that many countries contribute for a common goal, and bilateral funds are funds coming just from the United States to developing countries as a form of assistance. In terms of multilateral funds, we are asking you to ask Congress to support the Global Environmental Facility, and it's consistently received bipartisan support. And the Global Environmental Facility serves as a financial mechanism for a number of multilateral environmental initiatives to support small-scale renewable energy projects, children's health, and biodiversity conservation. And we know how important energy access is for addressing poverty, maternal health, and education, access to healthcare. So these kinds of programs are really important for communities. And additionally, we would like you to support the Adaptation Fund. It's the United Nations Adaptation Fund, and it directs funding towards small-scale country-led projects, such as promoting agricultural resilience, addressing food insecurity, and helping coastal communities to respond to the threats of climate change. And this would be the United States' first time contributing to this fund, but it is also an important financial mechanism for the Paris Agreement. And now I will turn it over to Angelique to share the bilateral funds.
Thank you so much, Chloe, for sharing the first ask and even the beginning of the second one. Thank you so much. So we want to go to, again, the final international ask, which is to support additional multilateral and bilateral funds that repair global relationships and engage in diplomatic partnerships while working to address our disproportionate contributions to climate change and addressing other environmental challenges. So the bilateral funds. The bilateral funds are an important mechanism for the United States to strengthen strategic country partnerships and to demonstrate goodwill to countries that are still in process of developing and are dealing with low income and middle income situations. The renewable energy under bilateral economic assistance is the request for $268.5 million. This program provides much needed energy access for the most economically impoverished communities in the world. And then finally, sustainable landscapes under bilateral economic assistance. The request is for $202.5 million. The Sustainable Landscape Program addresses rural poverty and sustainable land management while also incentivizing efforts to curb deforestation. These are our international asks, and we ask that you be advocates in this regard. So thank you so much. Over to you, Claire. Thank you.
Thanks so much all for sharing your wisdom and expertise in this field.
All right, thank you so much. That was a great video, and I feel more prepared, even though I was on the Ask Committee. I feel even more prepared after watching that video. So thank you guys for really concisely explaining our asks. And we are going to do a little Q&A now. So I'm just going to pose these questions to the group, and then whoever feels called to respond, please do. So the first question, we got a number of questions on the Biden infrastructure plan that's coming up. What are the gaps in this plan? And yeah, what are the gaps in this plan that you see?
I can take the first shot at answering. So one of the things that I think is important about the Biden plan is that it was just released. And so also we don't have exact language yet to know what the infrastructure plan will look like. There's talk about having social infrastructure as well as physical infrastructure being included. And so I think with one of the challenges that we have is that it sounds good in an idealistic sense, but we don't actually know what possible legislation could look like. We also don't know what vehicle it may get passed through. And so for us, it's kind of hard to talk about what the gaps may be. Like, for example, it does say, or there's talk that it would be a bill that would be able to help address inequities in, in the US when it comes to race. But that doesn't actually mean that it's true once we see it. And so right now, to, I guess, put it succinctly, is that it's just too early to really know the full gaps of what an infrastructure bill would look like, because we're still waiting to see it in greater detail.
Thank you so much, Karen. That was super helpful. There is a question that actually follows that up really nicely, and that is, should we ask our legislators to support that plan specifically? So what I'm hearing, I think that we want to aim for just saying these are our values and this is what we want to see in an infrastructure package, because like Karen said, we don't know what it's going to be attached to. Would any of the panelists like to respond further? That's okay if not.
I can go next.
Okay.
That's all right. Thank you. And I'm just building on what Karen said, and I absolutely agree in terms of like, what is it? And, you know, in terms of the sausage making and the value of faith communities lifting up the direction that we're going. I think the direction is very positive, but I've certainly seen analysis by various environmental justice, environmental groups, and faith groups saying this doesn't really go far enough. Right, so the direction is good, but we need to be bolder and stronger. And so there is language around highways, infrastructure. How do we get there, right? There's language around electric vehicles, yes, but is that amount sufficient as well? And how is it centering Black, Indigenous, communities of color? And will they be at the table in leading those conversations, right? And what their needs and priorities are. One of the other things I wanna highlight is that there's actually, in terms of what the Biden plan is saying about clean energy, it includes things like nuclear, right? Concern that many of our faith traditions and denominations have concern around. So I think what we do want to emphasize, especially if we're talking about environmental justice, is if we're talking about clean energy, make sure that it's clean. Make sure that it's not harming Indigenous communities, that there's free, prior, and informed consent. With Indigenous communities, impacted communities, and that we want really, truly energy that is clean and just. So in terms of the infrastructure package itself, I think we want bolder, the direction is good, but it needs to be moving forward, and that whatever legislative vehicle that it's used, that we want it to be prioritized, right? We want climate justice to be prioritized in the categories that we've been discussing.
Thank you so much, Liz. Really appreciate that framing and that context. Yeah, we don't want to support something that creates sacrifice zones, and that is why it's so important to emphasize the values that we're coming from in our specific asks. Would anyone else like to add to that, or should we move on to the next question? All right, so let's move on to, let's move on to the international ask, at least for now. So which of the international asks do we believe are already priorities for the administration, and where do we expect to see some resistance?
I can say that these are all priorities for the Biden administration, and that there's a strong desire to see climate finance, and especially the Green Climate Fund. Since the last 4 years, there's been no money from the US government given to the GCF. And so, yes, this is a shared priority that we have with them. And the challenge will be to get Congress to support that priority, since they have yet to fund GCF. And they have consistently funded these other accounts at lower levels. So we're hoping to have those levels restored to what they should be now. The adaptation fund would also be a new one, but these are very important for our role in the world. And I know someone else asked about the like why the certain numbers are that we chose and put forward. And the $2 billion is what we still owe. You know, that we had a $3 billion commitment that we made over a 5-year period. And again, we've given no money in the last 4 years. So at a minimum, we need to repay our debt, you know, and meet our commitment that we've made to developing countries, low and middle income countries, and to the world. So that's part of why we chose that number. And I can also say that for the other numbers, we drew from consultation with other colleagues in the development community who are also supporting these numbers.
coming from Interaction, which is a network of development organizations that a number of faith-based organizations in the EAD network belong to as well. Anyone else want to add? Karen, do you have anything else you'd want to say to that?
So I saw Clara was about to answer. So okay, well, thanks. The only thing I would say, yeah, I think the biggest hesitancy or the biggest challenge that we would have would be more so around the amount. As Chloe talked about, the $2 billion will be a challenge. From what I've heard in my role as Fred, it doesn't sound like there may be a lot of appetite, especially within this fiscal year, to do the $2 billion. And so that's something that we as the faith community is so important that we really advocate for that, because, you know, it's something where, as Chloe said, we need to fulfill what we promised to the rest of the world that we would do for this cause. And that's just the bare minimum at this point that we're asking for. And so that, I think, will be the biggest challenge. We want to see that more immediately so that we can put more financing in the future towards advancing the work. But yes, I think it's very important for the world that we commit to what we did, because, you know, we are coming back as a leader around the world when it comes to the last, you know, few months. And it's important for us to follow through on the commitment that we said we would do, and to show that we are moving forward as a nation, especially when it comes to climate work.
Yeah, and the Biden administration put forth $1.25 billion in their budget that they just released, which is far less than I think the community wanted to see. And I think even what they know is really what is needed. They put forward what they think might be politically feasible, but it's our job as advocates to push for more. And, you know, at a minimum, maybe they will get their 1.25 billion that they've asked for, but they need to be hearing that there's a need for more money, that we need to fulfill our commitments. So your voice on the Hill will be very important to move forward any GCF funding, since we're starting from zero, really.
Thank you guys so much. So we have a couple other general questions, but before I get to that, I just want to remind everyone, please keep putting your questions on either the international or the domestic ask or general questions into the chat. We would like to be able to get to as many as we can, so please go ahead and keep doing that. All right, the first more general question is, for those of us who live in districts where most of these concerns fall to hostile ears, does anyone have helpful, successful strategies for dialogue with representatives who deny the realities of climate change?
I have some just initial thoughts about this, and then I'll let the rest of y'all jump in. I will say on the international ask, you can emphasize this kind of funding. International assistance like this has historically been bipartisan. This hasn't been as partisan as a lot of other climate policies. So that's something you can bring up and emphasize. And I think these conversations have been happening in other spaces. I know it happened in one of the denominational gatherings I was in yesterday. But folks asking about like language specifically. And I would say maybe think about alternatives to the word climate change, or maybe not that explicit, but other phrases that might turn an office off a little bit less. So that could be resilience to extreme weather. That's something I often advise folks on, but I would invite my colleagues also to challenge that or build on that.
Happy to jump in next. Thank you. What an important question. And for those of you who are in districts and states where there is hostility, or just kind of like they're not even responding to your request, what a holy task that you have. I want to affirm that because we are all in different locations. And some of us, we could ask for our legislators to go even further, right? For those of us in certain states, you are actually in those states where the power to influence, if that senator or representative makes a decision in a different direction, it has huge impact. So I just want to acknowledge the heavy lifting that you are doing in part of this larger ecumenical community. And, our prayers are with you, and we're there with you, even though we're not physically with you, first that cloud of witnesses. And so just affirm what Clara is saying. And I also think sometimes because you are the constituent, they are there to listen to you. They may not agree with you, right? But they are there to listen to you, and to be true to your faith convictions, I think is also important. So and the science is behind us, in fact, around climate change and the climate crisis, who it's impacting, and framing it saying that this is a non-political issue, right? Being very proactive. I know it's been politicized, but this is nonpartisan. And I'm deeply concerned as a person of faith, give your reason why. And you can speak about the climate science if you so choose to. Another way to frame it is to think about the environmental impact that the causes of the climate crisis is having. So that's why, in some of our talking points, we lifted up fossil fuels, right? Health impacts. It's the main contributor. So if people don't want to talk about, global warming, well, fossil fuels, air pollutions, it's impacting children. It's impacting our air quality of our community. It's increasing health burdens, right? Our hospitals are being buckled in, et cetera. So that might be another way. Children's impact, et cetera. The thing is the economic benefit. Renewable energy the costs have gone down significantly. So why wouldn't we tap into this source that's actually cleaner? So the economic impact may be something. And as Karen had noted earlier, share your own personal context, right? Natural disasters in your community, air pollution in your community, diesel school buses in your community, crumbling infrastructure in your community, and that ask. So those might be helpful, but again, thank you for doing that effort. For those of us in spaces that are more inclined to hear, we want them to go further. For those who are in more challenging spaces, then it is you're speaking truth to power, essentially.
Yeah, I would like to add, I want to take note of what Anita Cruz said in the chat, focusing on the impacts of their own communities and districts, lifting your stories from other people who are their constituents. That is so important. As Liz just said, lifting up the point of keeping it personal. How has their district or their community been impacted is so important to the conversation. I also would just add quickly that it's also these bills or these things that we're suggesting, policy is an opportunity for local communities. It's an opportunity for those who have lost industries due to, certain industries being closed down, such as coal. It's an opportunity for investment in those communities. And so even if they don't necessarily connect so much on the climate change or global warming or whatever the impact is, the opportunity for investment is in the interest of their constituents. And so I would also not just come from a, kind of gloom and doom perspective, but also from where's the opportunity in what is being argued in this moment and what we're championing. We are caring for creation. Those type of terms are also very fruitful to use. But yes, keep it, where's the opportunity in this for those who are more hesitant to, act on climate issues?
Thanks, everyone. Great answers and ideas. The next question is, are we encouraged to add or emphasize in our ask specific recommendations related to our own state or related to the communities in which our lawmakers are members?
Sorry, Annika, can you repeat the beginning of the question?
Absolutely. Are we encouraged to add or emphasize in our ask specific recommendations related to our own state or related to the committees in which our lawmakers are members? And I'm going to actually really quickly encourage everyone, you don't have to do this now, but after this, to check out our talking points, because it does have some regionally specific points that you can utilize. But after that, let me please pass it to the panelists to answer that question. Should people use examples from their communities, from their states, from their regions, in their conversations with their decision makers? And then in addition, should they also keep in mind what are the committees that their representative is on?
Well, I think it's important to stick with, you know, the asks of the conference, but within that, I think the way that you talk about the ask, that it's always good to be able to tie it to what's happening at the local level in your community, in your state, that should have resonance with the lawmaker, and they're there really to serve you. So I do think there's value in using the stories that you have from your experience. And if something's happening on a local level initiative that you're aware of that you think ties well to the broader ask that we're asking for, especially in the domestic part, then sure, go ahead and use it. And if you know that there's maybe a certain argument from a, you know, perspective they come from on a committee they're on that seems like it would be helpful for making your point, then go ahead and use that too. But definitely, I think we would like to stress that you come and bring your own experience, your own stories, your own local knowledge when you go about making your asks. And it's your space, your opportunity to share, you know, why this is important to you. So I would offer that advice.
I would echo that as well. And again, there are a lot of asks. So we recognize that in the time that you have, you may not also be able to cover everything. And so if you're adding to the ask, sometimes it may actually dilute. My recommendation would be if you have additional asks that don't really fit within this, request for another meeting. So you amplify those concerns as well, because sometimes if it becomes a kitchen sink, then the staffer that we're speaking with may miss the message. And the other thing, just as a reminder, you'll be talking about this later in our state breakouts, is ensure that you email the leave behind afterwards, because the asks are delineated. So again, we don't have to cover everything. The asks, we can email them, they can look at it for review. And our point is really to highlight that their constituents are concerned to move forward. And we want to share our personal stories and connections.
Great, thank you. Another question is, what is the congressional timeline for considering and passing a budget?
So I don't have an exact answer to that, but the budget does end every year on September 30th. And so that is the timeline. I will say, as long as I've been working in policy, it has never happened during that time. And so even then, spring is, we will expect, I want to say sometime in June, that the or May or June, that we'll see President Biden release a more detailed budget for what is his hope for the upcoming fiscal year. And then once that happens, at that point, Congress will be getting more into detail about what a future budget will actually look like. So typically, like I said, it doesn't typically always happen, but at the very least, we'll know there'll be some type of continuing resolution or something, but we will be looking to really see a bill ideally in late summer, early fall when it comes to something getting passed.
Thank you. So as far as I know, those are all of the questions. We did get some double questions, but we obviously only asked that once. So one thing that I will shout out is to make sure to go to see the talking points as well as the leave behinds. That's going to be super helpful as you prepare for your meeting. And with that, I just want to say thank you so much to the panelists who also made the video. We really appreciate the time that you put into it and for being here to answer all of our questions. Your answers were super helpful, and I know we'll be able to go into our meetings that much more prepared. So thank you all so much. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Jose for announcements.
Actually, first, a couple of questions.
Oh, were there more questions?
Just one important one. Someone asked, can we get the legislative asks to lobby our representatives later if we're not able to attend tomorrow's lobby day? I got a lot of, okay, excellent. Also, will any of our policy experts somehow be available if there are any questions that the participants have, especially as they're stepping into their delegation meetings, any way that they can continue to hone their understanding as well as their ask. I'm not sure, folks, if we've allowed for that channel, so I ask that knowing we may not have an answer yet.
I might have an answer to that. I believe that there will be a representative from the EAD leadership team and possibly even the Ask Committee at the state breakouts. So you should be able to ask then. I believe that is correct. But if I'm wrong, please correct me. Yeah, that would be good. But that is from my memory, there should be someone available there.
Okay, thank you. So I'm here to remind folks that your lobby day, lobby delegation meetings are happening at 4 o'clock today. And then also, if you go to your conference website and go to the left side, if you see the dome, that has all of the information that our wonderful panelists have provided, including talking points, leave behind, as well as a roadmap, a lobby roadmap for you to use for your delegation meetings. And we also encourage you, when you do have those meetings, to please fill out a report for us. It's so important that we hear back from you, and it provides us with so much more information and support as we continue to lobby and as your communities continue to lobby on these important asks. So that's all I have in my role here. Annika, wondering if there's anything else before we close.
I did get one more question that filtered in, and that was just on where can we find the information on state breakouts, and that's all going to be on Attentify, and there on the side panel there should be an option to learn about state breakouts, and then it's also going to be in the schedule. So check there and the information will be available. Otherwise, that's all I see. So that's all we have. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy your next workshop.
It does appear there's still some questions about the lobby visits. When people want to know when their visits are set, and the training's happening from 4 to 5:30 today. And I believe that information should have gotten out about when the visits are set, but maybe one of you can correct me on that. But do show up from 4 to 5:30 today, and I'm sure you'll learn a lot more about it. And I think it's going to be recorded as well. Yeah.
Right. That I think, Chloe, you answered that as well as I could too. So thank you. All right. Was there anything else I missed for the others on the other moderators? No? All right. Thanks, everyone.
There's a sickness here that threatens to divide us, and we're all afraid to say its name out loud. Lord, I know that you can heal us of this virus, so we need you right now. There's a darkness here that's dangerous and aggressive. It's getting harder every day to shake its power. But Lord, I know that you can free us from oppression. So we need you right now. 'Cause we don't know what to do, so we'll turn our eyes to you. And we've run out of words to say, but if you come and have your way, you can save us from ourselves. Before our wounds hurt someone else, we need you now. What does it mean to have compassion for another? How can I claim the love of God that I can't see? If I can find the will to harm and kill my brother, 'cause he neglected to look like me. And I can speak the words of men and songs of angels. I can give all my possessions to the poor. But if your love can't move the mountains of my hatred, somehow I missed you, and I need you so much more. 'Cause I don't know what to do, so I'll turn